Have you told your friends that you see ghosts?
Oh, absolutely not.
Gina Rodriguez returns in Not Dead Yet.
I'm back, baby.
Who is that?
Oh, she's the obituary writer.
And Brad Garrett joins the brilliant ensemble cast.
Titan, Maverick, Titan of all Mavericks. These are all words used to describe me.
Not Dead Yet. Season premiere. Tonight, 8:30, 7:30 Central on ABC. And stream on Hulu.
It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, it's Dr. Justin Coulson. Welcome to the Happy Families podcast. We have been receiving via podcasts at happyfamilies.com.au a number of emails about one podcast episode in particular. One of those penny drop kind of moments where people are saying, now I get it. So in this podcast, we're going to share something that I've shared previously because it has helped so many people with so much stuff. If you missed it the first time, this is the conversation about structure versus autonomy. That is, the way that we implement rules, limits, and boundaries with our children in a way that actually supports their autonomy rather than detracts from it. See, limits and boundaries sound like they're taking away autonomy, and yet autonomy is the thing that helps the family to run well. So in this episode, that's where we're going. A replay from one of our most helpful podcasts perhaps ever.
So a couple of people were really struggling with the idea of structure. When we think about structure, it's all about boundary setting for our kids. And yet your book is heavily focused on being autonomy supportive, needs supportive in your parenting. And if autonomy equals freedom for our kids, how does structure work in with that? Because is that not counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve with our kids?
So structure is about limits and autonomy is about freedom. How do they work together?
Yeah.
So the definitions really matter here. And I think that it's a pretty easy one to resolve, but it's worth spending about 10 minutes on because this will fundamentally change the way that we raise our kids. Oh, and by the way, maybe you don't need to buy the book if you listen to this conversation. I mean, if it's helpful, that's great. So first of all, let's get clear on what structure is, what structure means. Structure is what we provide to help kids to feel competent.
So you talk about structure, and because I'm a very visual person, I actually am going straight to a swimming pool.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have a body of water without a structure to hold it in.
Great.
Right. So if I want my kids to actually be able to enjoy the water, then I need a structure in place to hold the water in there.
Okay. So, and I think of a soccer field, similar sort of metaphor. That is, if you want to enjoy a game of soccer or netball, you have to follow the rules. Like the game only exists because the structure has been put in place. The rules and limits have been put in place. Netball ceases to be netball if you break out of the structure that defines netball. For example, if you grab the ball and run at your opponent, suddenly it's not netball anymore, it's rugby. Or you dribble. Yeah, then it's basketball. And so structure is another word for rules or limits or boundaries. It's the structure that makes stuff work. And structure doesn't just apply to sport. Structure applies to things like mornings and evenings. Like when you have an established structure, mornings make sense and the kids feel competent because they know what's expected at any given time.
So the kids, for instance, they know that they wake up at a certain time, they have breakfast at a certain time, and then they've got a few jobs that they need to do before they go to school.
Right.
We're talking about structure.
And as they satisfy the requirements of the structure, they feel competent. They actually feel good about themselves. Whereas if they don't know what's expected or there is no structure, they often don't feel good at all. They feel all legs akimbo, like all a bit funny about things.
Would you suggest then that maybe without that structure, they actually feel overwhelmed because there's too many options available to them?
Yeah, that's right. And they'll often just end up sitting on the couch and staring at a screen because what do I do? It's overwhelming. I'm going to do whatever's easy. I'm going to take the path of least resistance. But structure doesn't just apply to things like school or mornings or evenings or sport. It applies to how we get along in our home. Like the way our relationships work. There's a structure. We have structures and rules and limits and boundaries around things like respect and kindness and helping and that kind of thing. So structure is the kind of clunky psychological term that researchers use to describe how things work, what makes things make sense, how we can make life predictable, because that's how kids develop their sense of competence, which is the need that we're trying to support here. So if structure applies across the board, what it's really about is creating a sense of predictability, because when the kids know that life is predictable, they can then competently follow the path. They can follow the boundaries, the limits, whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I guess the next question is then, how does autonomy play within this structure? Because if I'm struggling with this concept, then the idea of creating these boundaries is limiting my children from being able to utilize their autonomy.
Some people, when they hear me talking about autonomy, they think that the kids are going to be independent. They're going to have complete freedom. They can do whatever they want. That's not what autonomy...
That's anarchy.
Yeah, it kind of is. It's not going to be healthy. And because our children developmentally are not at a place where they're ready for that level of freedom, I mean, even as adults, there are structures around us, like road rules, for example. We have laws, and they provide structure to our lives. We have jobs, they provide structure to our lives. All of these things, we have things like Christmas. All of these things are structures. They help us to have a predictable way of living our lives. But we also have a high level of autonomy as adults, because we've figured out how to navigate life functionally using those structures for the support that they give us, and also for access to things that we wouldn't have without those structures. When it comes to the kids, they're not ready. They're just not ready for full-fettered freedom. Full-fettered? Unfettered. Unfettered freedom. Full-fettered would be the opposite of unfettered. They're not ready for unfettered freedom. They need a wise, mature, experienced guide beside them as they develop their own understanding of what the structures are, both in our family and at school and in the broader society.
So this reminds me of one of my very first art lessons.
Right.
It was just an unstructured activity with a friend. She had all the things out on the table, literally, like there was pastels, there was watercolors, there was acrylics. It was all there. And she sat me down and she said, "You can do whatever you want."
Overwhelming.
And I sat there for about 5 minutes.
Right.
Looking at everything and thinking, well, I could do that, but I'm not sure how to use that properly. And I was paralyzed in my ability to make a choice because there was just so much available to me, and yet none of it made sense. And so it wasn't until she realized what was going on and she's, okay, hang on a sec. And she ripped out a piece of paper and she handed it to me and she said, "We're just going to draw the same flower, all of us. We're just going to give it a go with a pencil." And as a result of doing that, we shared the drawing. So we did a collaborative drawing. We each did a different step. And all of a sudden, it wasn't so daunting anymore. She created a structure around what was available that I could then go, oh, I can do that.
Here's the critical thing about autonomy, though. Within the framework or the structure that was provided, now we've got some rules. We're going to all draw this flower. You still had a huge amount of choice. You had the opportunity to independently determine, to self-determine what color I'm going to draw, what size I'm going to draw, what medium I'm going to use. Am I going to actually paint this thing, or am I going to draw it? Am I going to do it in black and white or color? Like, you still had a whole lot of capacity to choose. And so when it comes to structure and autonomy with our kids, the idea is we create opportunities to develop structure together with them having as much of a voice as is reasonable for their age. I mean, you're going to give your 13 or 14-year-old a whole lot more voice than you will your 2 or 3-year-old, but they can still have a whole lot of voice.
When your kids are young, for instance, you could suggest you can wear this outfit or this outfit.
Yeah, that kind of feels a little bit forced to me. Let me share an experiment that I write about in the book, in The Parenting Revolution, that might be helpful. I just think it's a profoundly useful tool for teaching how these things work together. So a researcher from Canada, his name is Richard Kestner. He's the nicest guy, soft-spoken, kind, gentle, just a really delightful human. And Kestner and his colleagues went into a preschool and they got 40 kids in one condition and 40 kids in another experimental condition. And they basically watched to see what would happen with a specific activity that they were doing. So for the first 40 kids, they walked into the room and said, "Hey guys, we're going to do a painting activity." And all the kids said, "Okay, fantastic." Now remember, these are preschoolers. They're aged 4, maybe 5 for the oldest kids, but around 4 or 5 years of age. We're going to do some painting. And then they said to these 40 kids, "Oh, but we need to make sure that we don't make any mess while we're painting. So you can hear, here comes the structure. They, with the first group, took a controlling approach. There was not a lot of autonomy involved. And so they said, if we're going to paint, we need to make sure that we don't get any painting on our clothes. So let's put our smocks on so that we don't get any paint on our clothes. And we don't want to get any paint on the table either, do we? And so all the kids they're having fun. Like, it's not hardcore authoritarian command and control. But they said, let's get the cardboard out and let's put it underneath our paper so that we don't paint off the paper and onto the table, because the cardboard will soak up any extra paint. And they said, we also need to make sure that we don't mix the paint colors. So the rules are that when you finish with one color, you need to dip that paintbrush in the water and get all the paint out of it. And then you can get the water off and then dip it in the new paint color and keep on painting. So they were quite directive in a gentle and kind way in this controlling condition. With the other 40 kids on the other side of the preschool center, they took a totally different approach. They said, guys, we need to make sure that we're not making a big mess, don't we? What do you think we should do? And then in conversation with the kids said, well, we can't get paint on our clothes. And I said, well, what do we do so that we don't get paint on our clothes? And the kids said, we've got to wear our paint smocks. And they said, you bet. And they said, is there anything else we need to make sure we don't get paint on? And the kids said, we can't get paint on the table. And they said, well, how do we protect the table? And the kids came up with a solution to get the great big pieces of cardboard, cardstock, and put it underneath the paper. And they said, is there anything else that we need to be careful of when we're painting? And the kids said, yeah, we don't want to mix the paints up. And they said, well, how do we fix that? And the kids came up with the solution. So in both cases, we've got adults who are involved in a conversation with kids about creating structure. But in one, autonomy is being thwarted with adults who are saying, you need to do it like this and you need to do it like that, even though they're doing it kindly. And then in the other group, you've got this group of kids who are being guided to the solutions as the parents, or the adults, I should say, just ask questions like, is there anything else we need to do? What else would be important? So the answers are coming from inside the kids. Their autonomy is being supported, and the control or the structure is also being developed. But it's being developed as much as possible by the kids. Now, what Kestner found in this study is that the kids who were in the control group versus in the autonomy group, once the painting was finished, they were observed for a short period of time to see what they would do with their free time before the activity was fully completed. And the kids who were in the control group, they kind of stopped painting and looked for other things to do. Whereas the kids who had been in the supportive group, they didn't want to stop painting. They were happy to just do another painting. So their task persistence, their motivation for the task was higher when they were involved, when they had autonomy, when they had a sense of self-determination in terms of developing the structure. And that's really what's at the heart of it. When something needs to happen, to the extent that we can with our kids, are we going to be controlling about how it happens, or are we going to support their autonomy? Are we going to explain, here's the situation, what do you think we should do? Or are we going to say, here's the situation, now do this?
So I guess my point about giving them a few options instead of multiple options is just like me being in that craft room and having all of the mediums available to me and feeling overwhelmed when we've got really young kids, providing them with a few options as opposed to the whole wardrobe.
Yeah, exactly. You might say, it's pretty cold outside because it's winter. So we've got some warm clothes here and some warm clothes here. Which ones do you think will be best?
So what I'm hearing from you is that structure actually underpins our children's ability to be able to exercise their autonomy because they understand the rules and therefore they feel like they've got a level of competence to be able to follow through with what needs to happen.
And the beautiful thing about this process is it's relationship building. So it supports all of their basic psychological needs. It helps them to feel close and connected and understood and seen and heard and valued. It helps them to feel like life is predictable and they understand why things are happening because they're involved in the process of developing the why and how. And they get to have a voice. That autonomy is supported. I think it's a really important conversation to have. That's really what the whole book is about. I mean, I've tried to summarize 240 pages in 10, 12.
I wish you had done that before I read it.
I'm so glad that you have. This is exciting that you've read one of my books. Anyway.
What do you mean? I've read them all. Thank you very much.
I usually tease people when I give my presentations and say that you like my shortest one, What Your Child Needs From You, you know, the one that takes 2
Well, I
hours
did for a long time.
because it was the only one that you'd ever read. But you have read them now, and I probably should stop saying that because it makes it sound like you're not involved, and you are, and I love that you are. Thank you so much to Justin Rulon, our producer, for making the podcast sound the way it sounds. We also appreciate Craig Bruce, our executive producer. If you want more about making your family happier, please visit our website, happyfamilies.com.au, or grab a copy of this fabulous book called The Parenting Revolution.
Who's it by again?
By yours truly.